right, welcome to the Lowly Shepherd Podcast. As always, I'm Pastor Jay, and with me, my compatriot, Travis Welch, is with us and is going to be with us for the duration of this study. As we've been talking about, we're getting into the Book of Ephesians, and we're going to kind of go verse by verse, passage by passage, and really try to break it down for you. As I said at the beginning of the year, my goal with this is to give you the best, most up-to-date information and interact with all the latest scholarship that at least that I have available to me. To be able to give you the most streamlined, and emphasis on streamlined, I'm hoping to keep it streamlined, version of what you can use and hopefully make this useful content that you can use in Bible study, sermon preparation, or just your own personal devotional study. And so we're going to get into the book of Ephesians today with the introduction today. As I was thinking about this, we live in a time right now under this whole COVID epidemic where church attendance has kind of taken an all-time dive, really. And I know I'm a pastor, and of course many of the pastors in my association, the ones that I have talked to, they've 30-40% drop at least in their weekly attendance since this whole COVID mess stopped. And of course, the church is shut down for a while, and the proliferation of online services, and you just got a whole percentage group of people that just never really came back to the church. And that just got me thinking about this as I was reading into Ephesians here, because Paul talks about at the beginning of the book of Ephesians about the mystery of the church and how it was really organized by God from the foundations of the world to, this was God's plan to bring about the mystery of his gospel to the world and this union that he was going to bring into effect. And Paul has such a high view of the universal church, and unfortunately, it just seems like most people today don't have such a high view of the church. They kind of view it as a building or, just kind of a weekly service that I go to with my family for an hour or two on Sunday mornings, and then that's about it. And then once you get out of the habit, once you get out of that routine of doing that, you just don't really see the point or the value of the church anymore. And unfortunately, a lot of churches probably see themselves that way, and that's kind of how it goes. And I really have enjoyed reading in the book of Ephesians, reminding me as a pastor of a church what the purpose of the church is and how high in value God esteems the church. It was his idea, after all. This is not a man-made thing. This was Christ's idea, this establishment of the church. And so as we get into it, I want to talk about the book of Ephesians. And the way we're going to divide this up going forward is I'm typically going to address more of the scholarly, text-critical issues. The stuff that you're generally going to find in your commentaries, I'm going to generally handle. And then Travis is going to kind of focus more on the overall. I'm looking at the trees. He's going to look at the forest.
I feel like fly by the seat of my pants kind of a thing.
Like any good pastor, right?
Yeah.
So he's going to give us more of the pastorally kind of key themes, kind of the overview of what's going on in that section. Because, like I said, I'm going to dig into the nitty gritty. He's going to kind of put it all together for you, and we're going to kind of tag team it like that. We hope. This ideally is what we're going for. So we'll see how it goes. It may be a train wreck, but it'll be our train wreck, and hopefully God will bless it one way or the other. But as we get into this, the book of Ephesians has been called like a masterpiece of theology. A masterpiece of theology. I read one commentator saying that. And the more you read it, the more it really is. And I know the book of Romans has been considered by some as sort of a systematic theology of Paul's theology, but really, it's Ephesians that's really like the ultimate evolution of Pauline theology. It's the most well-developed, most complete thought of like just well-rounded out thought of Paul's theology of any of his letters that he writes. And it kind of gets overlooked in a lot of ways in that regard because, like I said, the prevalence on Romans. And it's true that there's much more, and we'll get into this, much more passionate kind of speaking and more direct kind of punchy language in Romans than there is in Ephesians. And sometimes Ephesians can be kind of a slog to get through kind of reading. Because it has these long, drawn-out sentences that you'll read a whole passage like we're going to look at next week and be like, wait, what did that say?
I think we're kind of approaching the end of Paul's ministry when we get into Ephesians.
Oh, yeah.
As when we're in Romans, it's like he's establishing theology straight. And when we get to Ephesians, I think his concern is here he is. He's at the end of his ministry, the end of his life. And, the church is being persecuted, and he's just trying to do what he can do to keep help this fledgling church keep going.
True enough. And as we're going to talk about, I think it's more of a general letter than many of his other letters as well, which influences a lot of how it's presented. So let's break down into it. Okay, well, I've kind of given the gig away pretty quickly, but let's talk about authorship. Well, it says in verse 1, I, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the will of God, to the saints who are in Ephesus and the faithful in Christ Jesus, grace to you and peace from God, our Father, and the Lord Jesus Christ. So who's the author? Paul. It says it right there, right?
Pretty straight.
Nothing else to say. Well, not quite, unfortunately, but I will tell you, for the first 1,800 years or so of the church, it pretty much wasn't disputed that Paul wrote this. It has really good, evidence and attestation pretty early on. We'll talk about in just a minute. Late 1700s, 1792, somewhere around there was a commentator that kind of started to question why was Paul addressing the Ephesians, whom he should know so well, particularly in verse 115, like he didn't know them. And so that kind of started sparking some questions, and some other commentators of the German critical school in the 1800s started questioning, hey, maybe Paul didn't write this, and started calling it Deutero-Paul, like Second Paul. And then that's led into the 1900s, where you had even more sort of critics that came out and started saying, there's just no way Paul actually wrote this, that it was somebody pretending to be Paul, writing like Paul, and that's how it came into the church. Well, I think I mentioned last time the commentaries. Harold Hoehner probably wrote the quintessential document on who wrote the Book of Ephesians on defending Pauline authorship, and he actually goes through the whole history of it. And he went through, and I think his book was written back in the late 80s, early 90s, that commentary. But at that time, there was some like 269 commentaries that he went through, and he estimated that something like 56% of them thought that Paul wrote it, 39% of them thought that he didn't write it, and then the rest of the percentage just was undecided. And so that's where it was, 20, 30 years ago. And it's still probably about that same level. Among evangelical scholars, there's really only three main ones, Andrew Lincoln, J.D. Dunn, and I think Ralph Martin maybe, are the only guys that are evangelical scholars that say, no, Paul didn't write it. But, most people think, Paul wrote it, but there are some reasons, before you dismiss it out of hand, there are some reasons why there are some sort of critical things going on, why maybe Paul didn't write it. And so I'm going to kind of give you a breakdown of those things, and then I'm going to argue why I think Paul actually did write it. But one of the reasons they give for denying Pauline authorship of Ephesians is the Greek syntax and the vocabulary of the language of the letter. As we mentioned earlier, there are long, complicated sentences in the book of Ephesians that don't really appear anywhere else in Pauline's writings. In Paul's writings. It's, that first passage we're going to look at next week, verses 3 through 14, is all one long sentence. I mean, it's broken up with periods and stuff in English, but in Greek, it's one long sentence. And that's not typically how Paul writes in like Romans and Galatians and what's called the undisputed Pauline letters. They're pretty sure Paul did write those. He's typically shorter and more concise and terse in his language. And so that kind of draws some eyebrows, raises some eyebrows on that. Ephesians is much more wordy and redundant in Greek than most of the other letters that Paul is typically associated with having written. There's also a number of what's called hapax legomenon. That's one of those fancy seminary words that means appears only once or only used once. And so there are a lot of words in the book of Ephesians, Greek words, that are only used once in Ephesians, and they only appear like, maybe one other time in all of the New Testament or, something like that. But there's, 40 of them that appear nowhere else in the New Testament, and then there's like 56 of them that does not appear anywhere else in Paul's letters that are undisputed. And so there's some word choice issues going on there. He's using different vocabulary in Ephesians than he does in some of these other letters like Romans and Galatians. And so, there's just a lot of these kind of textual issues that people kind of, say, well, maybe Paul didn't write it, maybe somebody else did, because he's, the style seems to be different. The second one is they'll argue the theology, as we talked about at the very beginning, the theology is much more developed than most of Paul's earlier letters, like Romans and Galatians. Now, as we argued, I think this is written later, as we're going to argue, so that's not really a big problem for me. His theology is more developed, years later after he's written these other letters. But there's also some, that see that there's less of an emphasis on the cross and on the death of Christ in the book of Ephesians, unlike Romans or Galatians, where he's definitely emphasizing those things. The eschatology seems to be more focused on the here and now rather than looking towards the coming of Christ, as most of the other letters of Paul are. And so there's some questions about some of the theology that's going on there, and how that gets used that's different from the other Pauline letters. There's what I mentioned before, that people tend to talk about the seeming lack of familiarity with the audience that he's writing to. If this is Paul writing to the churches in Ephesus, Paul spent 3 years in Ephesus. I mean, he made it like a missionary center, and sent missionaries out from there to go found churches all around the Lycus Valley and Laodicea and Colossae and etc. And even though he didn't start those churches, he sent disciples out from Ephesus to do that. And we have ample evidence from the book of Acts about how long an extended stay, actually it is longer than anywhere else he stayed, in Ephesus. So it seems weird that he would talk to the Ephesians as if he didn't know them. And so that does kind of raise an eyebrow and kind of give some questions there. There's also the lack of personal greetings. All these other letters of Paul, like Romans and Galatians, hey, greet so-and-so here, and this guy says hi to you over there, and all that kind of stuff. In Ephesians, you don't get any of that stuff. And so that's kind of an oddity. But there's a reason for that, as we're going to talk about in just a minute, I believe, anyway. The last one that typically gets talked about is the reliance on the book of Colossians. There's something like, of the 155 verses in Ephesians, 73 of them are similar and almost word for word in one case to Colossians. And so it's really kind of a weird circular argument, because there's questions about the authorship of Colossians. The critical scholars will look at that and say, well, this guy's copying Colossians, which also wasn't written by Paul, so certainly Paul wouldn't copy some other guy that wasn't Paul, and so therefore this one also can't be written. So that I mentioned that one last because to me that seems like the weirdest argument, because they're making the assumption that Paul didn't write Colossians, which maybe we'll do Colossians next and talk about that one, but because there's a lot of fun stuff in that one too. But no, I think there's reasons to believe that Paul wrote Colossians as well, also, but to make that argument that, well, we're going to begin with the assumption that he didn't, and because this guy copies it, then therefore he couldn't have written Ephesians. Well, it's a ridiculous argument. But so there are some reasons. The language and the grammar kind of gives you a pause a little bit, but there are reasons for that, I think. And then also like the talking to them like he doesn't know them, that kind of gives you pause. But like I said, there are reasons for believing that Paul actually did write them, very good reasons that I will now give you. For one thing, as I mentioned earlier, there is very, very early attestation that Paul is the author of the Ephesians. You've got guys like Clement of Rome, who was actually a near contemporary of Paul. He did most of his ministry in the 80s, first century AD. So Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Hermas, Polycarp, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, all of these guys, first couple of century early church fathers, quoted extensively from Ephesians, and all of them attributed it to Paul. And I mean, they're all within a century or two of Paul's writing it. So it seems unlikely that tradition would have been twisted and lost that early on. And even we'll even give an argument from the heretical side of things as well. The Gnostic Marcion, the first sort of systematic Gnostic, I would say, of the 2nd century, put together actually the first New Testament canon, believe it or not. So a heretic put together the first New Testament canon. Now his didn't have all the stuff that we have in it because he excluded a lot of things. But he had in it, this book of Ephesians that was from Paul. Actually, he called it the Book of Laodicea, but we'll talk about that later. But he includes it as being written by Paul. So even a heretic includes Paul writing this letter. So that kind of adds to it as well. So the early attributions from these guys kind of points to that as being a good fact. I will argue about the differences in style as not being a very compelling argument. For one thing, we don't have a really large sample of Paul's writings. I mean, I know it seems like we do because we've got, so many letters here, and, some of them are pretty long, like Romans, etc., and 1st, 2nd Corinthians. It seems like we have a pretty good selection, but, if we were really trying to compare vocabulary, word choice, style of grammar, and the way that we do that, we'd really need a much larger sample of his writing material in order to be able to properly evaluate that. And I'm sorry I ran out of time in preparing for this. I was starting to trace down something that I had seen about some more recent computer models that they've actually plugged Ephesians into that actually shows there are more parallels with Pauline writings than were previously thought, but I wasn't able to find the references on that, so I apologize. Maybe I'll post that down there in the comments later when I find it and trying to track that down a little bit more. But all that to say, the grammar is not as different as it's made out to be by these critics. And a lot of it's really, really subjective. There's also the issues of writing different letters for different purposes is going to, necessitate different language, grammar, and style. If I'm writing a letter to my wife, it's going to sound different than a letter that I'm writing to the church. There are letters like Philemon that he is writing to a close personal friend that sound different than, the letter to the Romans, which is written more to a general church area. And so there are differences in grammar and style because of the purpose and the intent of the letter, and that's going to make a huge difference as well. There's also the fact that there's a lot of ample evidence that Paul used intermediaries in writing, secretaries, to write down. He would dictate to them, which was a common practice in ancient times, would dictate to these secretaries who would write them down. I mean, Paul, at least in Galatians, I think it is, he actually says, hey, see, I'm writing my name in my own hand here, implying that he wasn't writing the rest of it by his own hand. I can't remember which one it is now, but there's one where he says, I, so-and-so, I also greet you who is writing this letter. That actually might be Galatians too. And so, there's ample evidence that Paul used these secretaries. Well, using a different secretary is going to breed a different style, vocabulary, and word choice. And so, there's all sorts of reasons why the grammar could differ. So I don't think that the argument for that is not that it's not valid, but it's not a convincing or a compelling enough argument for me to discount the sort of historical traditions of Paul being the author. As I mentioned before, also Ephesians' reliance on Colossians is not a very compelling argument because it's a circular reasoning. You're assuming beforehand, a priori, that Paul didn't write Colossians. Well, that's not necessarily true. He did write Colossians, and if that's the case, then and I'm going to argue that he wrote these two letters at about the same time. So, of course, there's going to be some similarity between the letters. He's thinking the same thoughts and tracking on the same tracks as he's writing these two letters at a similar time to a similar region. Ephesus and Colossae are pretty close together. He's writing to a close region, and so they're dealing with some of the same issues. So, yeah, he's probably using some of the same language, some of the same thoughts and ideas. And so that doesn't seem like a reason to discount that at all. The lack of personal greetings could be explained by the fact that the letter was not written directly to Ephesians. It could be an encyclic letter, and that it is a letter that was meant to be passed around to all the churches in the region. There's some evidence of that. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the recipients part, but even if it was written to the Ephesians, Ephesus was a rather large city. And, even if he lived there for 3 years, it was impossible for him to know every Christian, especially since he's been out of the region for several years in prison and being moved to prison in Rome by this point. So there's a lot of reasons to discount that. And despite the so-called differences in his theology, all of the theology, even though it does represent a more developed theology than what he presents in some of the other letters, there's a lot of reasons for that. But all of the theology that's presented is very much Pauline theology. There's nothing there that is contrary to anything that Paul talks about in any of his other letters. And then the last thing I would mention for a good, probably the most compelling reason to believe that the book was written by Paul is that the Jews of the first century and early Christians did not ever accept pseudepigraphal writings as legitimate. There are a number of examples where early Christians, early church fathers would talk about a particular letter that was supposedly written by Peter or supposedly written by John or supposedly written by whoever, and they would say, nope, not going to have it. Kick it out, destroy it, get rid of it. We're not going to listen to that. It's fake. It's false. And it also seems rather odd for a letter that keeps talking about not living by falsehoods and deception to be a letter that was written by deception. So There's a lot of evidence that the early church would not have accepted this if it was not actually written by Paul. And so, all right. I know I spent a long time talking about that.
That wore me out.
I know. And I talked really fast, too. And believe me, like I said, as I mentioned in my commentary list last week, Honer spends 60 pages of his 1,000-page book talking about just the authorship of Ephesians. So it's a complicated issue. And so I'm scratching the surface on it, really. But the main point is I want you to understand that Paul wrote the book. And so for most of you, that's probably not an issue anyway. You were like, yeah, why are we even talking about this? But if you ever come across some of this critical stuff that somebody tosses at you, now you will be informed on how to deal with that and answer those questions when they get brought up to you.
Well, a lot of times people bring that stuff up just to create doubt in your head,
Right.
and try to rob you of your confidence in Scripture. When it says that Paul wrote it, I don't have any problems with just believing that Paul wrote it. And the difference is, we know that Paul used, what do they call it, the amanuensis, the secretary and stuff.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they think, I'm not Tychicus, it was his...
Tychicus, yeah.
Yeah, amanuensis, and so some of that kind of, you got the personality maybe coming out here. It's thought maybe that Paul had other issues like with vision and all that kind of thing, where he had to rely upon other people to actually pen it for him.
Oh, yeah.
And so that kind of makes some of the discrepancies that you have. But when it comes down to it, it's Paul.
Oh, yeah.
And regardless of that, you have to see it as being God's word. This is the word of God. That's your ultimate choice that you have to decide right there before you start meddling through all that other stuff.
True enough. All right. Well, the other ones won't be quite as long. The date. Well, when was this written? Well, probably around 62 AD. It's one of Paul's so-called prison letters. Colossians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Philemon are the four that were written while Paul was in prison, because each one of those letters actually say something to the effect about Paul being in chains or being under house arrest. And we know from the book of Acts and from church history that Paul was under house arrest in Rome somewhere between 61 and 62 AD. And that's typically, I'd say 99% of the people, at least that believe that Paul wrote it, would date it there. There is an outside possibility it was written sometime later. There is a tradition, an early church tradition, that Paul was released from house arrest, went on a fourth missionary journey to Spain. There are actually churches in Spain that claim to have been founded by the Apostle Paul. And then he came back, and once he came back to Rome, that was when Nero was all in power and going crazy on the Christians, and he was arrested and beheaded around 65, 66 AD. And so it could have been sometime then when he was writing it, but I think 62 is probably the more likely date of that. And it fits in time. Obviously, Colossians, with the similar matter, I do believe was written around the exact same time that Ephesians were, and sent to the same reason, which accounts for why there are such similarities between them. Now, obviously, if you don't believe that Paul wrote it, you're going to get different dates between the 80s and even into the 2nd century. Some of these crazy critics actually will say, and so. But it seems rather odd that Clement of Rome in 88 AD would be quoting Ephesians if it was written in the 2nd century, but go figure. Anyway, okay, the recipients. I mentioned this briefly, but there's a little bit of a controversy here, although much less than the authorship question. Who was the letter written to? Because there are actually a couple of early variants, some of the earliest copies of the Greek manuscripts that we have actually don't say Ephesus. They leave it blank. It says something to the effect of, in that verse 1, because here it says, to the saints who are in Ephesus and are faithful in Christ Jesus. These variants actually say something like, to the saints who are also faithful in the Lord Jesus Christ. And it kind of leaves out that, or it'll leave kind of a blank space, which has led some scholars, F.F. Bruce believes this, that it was an encyclical letter, meaning that it was passed around the region. And what they would do, and this was a common practice, and he actually presents a pretty compelling case, F.F. Bruce does, that this might be the case, because what they would do is they would make a copy of the letter, and then say it was going to go to Laodicea, they would write, to the faithful in Laodicea. They would write in, when they made their copy of it, to be read there, and then when it goes to the next city, they would write in that name, or the person that was reading it would say the name, and so the theory goes that, like, yeah, maybe there was one letter that was going all around this region, and maybe it started and ended up in Ephesus, and Ephesus being the most prevalent city in the region, that just tradition kind of stuck. Well, I mean, there's a lot to give credence to that because, I mean, like I said, the lack of personal greetings, the seemingly unfamiliarity with them in verse 115, because he says, I've heard about your faith, but I mean, wouldn't he know about it if he was in Ephesus? So there's a lot of things that kind of lend to that. Now, Clinton Arnold, in his commentary, actually gives a really long, compelling argument for why he believes it was actually written to Ephesus. And the seeming unfamiliarity that he would attribute would be to the fact that once again, it was a huge city that Paul wouldn't have known everybody, the distance in years that he's been in prison, but also that would have included all the surrounding regions, the suburbs, we would call them today, of Ephesus, so that he wouldn't know all those farming towns and whatnot that were all outside the city where churches were sprouting up. And so it could go either way. So I don't have a problem with it personally being a circular letter, but I don't have a problem with it being to the Ephesians either.
I think it was partly both. It was to the Ephesians, and it was passed around. And I think maybe it might have been passed around from family to family to family, not necessarily church to church to church.
Oh, that's a good point.
You get it. You get it. And here's the crazy thing: these guys, they get this letter and they read it, and they've only got like maybe a few days to read it before it's passed on to somebody else. And to think about getting that letter, them getting it, maybe have it for a few days, and they understand what it says. They get it. Yeah. We get it, and we mull over it for months and still can't figure out we can't even figure out who wrote the dadgum thing, And so they were much more.
Oh, yeah. When I talked about this, I did before this, I don't know if you've seen any of that or not on how to study the Bible. And we talk about the context. And because I've been preaching through Revelation on Sunday nights, and I was like, look, those 7 churches that John wrote it to understand Revelation better than we ever will because it was written to them in their context. They understood it.
Yeah, they didn't have the problem.
They didn't have near the problem that we're having with it. I mean, even a couple hundred years after it was written, people didn't understand what it was about. So, I mean, if they didn't understand it 2,000 years ago, we don't have much of a chance.
You try to explain all that Paul business to the people who received the letter, they wouldn't, what in the world are you talking about?
Exactly. We're unfortunately hindered by our distance and our lack of living in that culture. So anyway, it was written to the Ephesians in the general area around there, or it was a circular letter, or both. But either way, some actually think that this was the letter that was written to the Laodiceans. That's what Marcion thought, and that's actually what he called it in his canon of scriptures that he put together. There is, if you go and look in the book of Colossians, Colossians 4:16, it says, hey, take this letter that was written to the Colossians and take it to Laodicea, let them read it, and then you read the letter that the Laodiceans have. And since, once again, Colossians and Ephesians were probably written at the same time and very similar, some have suggested maybe that letter was this letter. But we don't have any real concrete evidence of that. It's really just speculation, but it's a possibility, so just something to consider. All right, last thing I'm going to talk about is the setting. We're going to talk just a little bit about the city of Ephesus and what's going on there and why that plays an important part in what's going on in the book of Ephesians. And really, like I said, it still works for a circular letter because the entire region of Asia Minor was dealing with a lot of these things. Ephesus was the most prominent city in that region. In fact, it was a port city. It was right on the coast, large commercial city. It was the 4th largest city in the Roman Empire in Paul's day, which I was fascinated to find out. I didn't realize it was that big. With around 250,000 people. It was 4th after Rome, Alexandria, Egypt, and Antioch. And then there was Ephesus. It was the center of imperial cult worship and then later emperor worship, especially by the time of Domitian, who set up like a 30-foot tall statue of himself, which, of course, John's dealing with that kind of stuff in Revelation in 95 AD. And so there was a lot of imperial cult worship. There was a lot of the worshiping of the pagan Greco-Roman gods. It housed the temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was the largest Greek temple in history. It was 4 times larger than the Parthenon in Athens. I didn't know that, but because that thing is huge. In Athens. That's kind of one of the modern wonders of the world, really. It's like this huge thing in Athens. It was 4 times larger than that. It was also a place of a lot of sorcery. There was a lot of magic and incantation stuff. I mean, they were shops on the street corner selling all kinds of occult, kind of crazy stuff and magic books and things like that. Paul, as I mentioned, spent 3 years in Ephesus. He met Priscilla and Aquila there. He worked in making tents for a while. There was an incident where, those guys were burning their magic books and stuff in the book of Acts once they came to Christ, because, like I said, that magic and the occult was very, very prevalent in the city of Ephesus. It was a spiritually dark place. And the last thing I'll mention, there's a weird reference. If you look in 1 Corinthians 15:32, and it's just kind of, people just glance over it and move on and don't really think about what it means. But he says in there, in his argument about the resurrection being true, in 1 Corinthians 15, he says something to the effect of like, I fought wild beast in Ephesus. And, what good was that if the resurrection is not true, or something to that effect, moving on. But what does it mean that he fought wild beast? That seems odd that he would fight wild beast in Ephesus, this major city. That's like fighting, a tiger in the middle of New York City. That seems like they didn't have zoos per se, like we have zoos, so that seems like an odd thing. Some have suggested, he's talking about those Christians who were being martyred by having to fight, in the auditoriums against wild animals and beasts and things like that. Well, that didn't happen in Paul's day. That happened much later. Maybe he was talking about outside the city walls. That, okay. Most scholars think he was talking about his human opponents, like Demetrius the silversmith in Acts is mentioned, and then Paul actually makes reference to him by name, at least in one place in one of his letters, that was opposing him. And so a lot of scholars think that this is, human adversaries he's calling wild beasts. An interesting thing I've tracked down recently suggests that the wild beast might actually be demonic powers that he's talking about. He's talking about spiritual battle, which would fit with the theme of Ephesians in chapter 6 when he talks about we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and rulers and authorities in the heavenly realm. There is a lot of ancient Jewish Second Temple literature that associates demons with wild animals. And that word therion in Greek is the same word that is used of the beast in Revelation. That's why it's tracking in my head, because I've been preaching through Revelation. We just went through chapter 13 the last couple of weeks. And so that's just kind of interesting. So that I just wanted to add that as an interesting little tidbit at the end. So maybe the wild beast that he was fighting in Ephesus was the spiritual battles that he was doing and waging there, which, like I said, would track with what he's saying in Ephesians chapter 6. All right. I've talked a lot, Travis. My throat hurts, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
I'm done.
Yeah, you go right ahead, man.
Here's a thought that I have, though, and this is I think that you could read the book of Ephesians, and for some reason, some people also make connections with that book to like 1 Peter or something, and the thought is, and it's rejected by a lot of Protestants and everything, because the Catholics have a theology built up around this where they try to make Peter the Pope and all that kind of thing. But there is thought that Peter and Paul somehow met up together in Rome while Paul was in prison in Rome. And I think in Peter it says something to the effect of attending the church in Babylon or whatever it may be. And the thought is that that's just a secret code word for Rome, because, in that day when Christians were being persecuted and dying and everything like that, you didn't identify Rome. You just kind of use these code words and everything. That's all guess, speculation. You don't know. But I used to read Ephesians and not have any connection to the book of Peter at all. I would just kind of read them separately, and I'd always have like there's a big gap between them and everything. But if you read it kind of thinking there is a connection, you begin to see some of those connections as well, written about the same time, that sort of thing. But the idea is that here Paul's toward the end of his life, Peter is toward the end of his life, Paul is trying to get something, established here, firmed up with the Gentile believers. Peter is trying to get things kind of firmed up with the Hebrew Jewish believers. And so Paul's doing his part through the book of Ephesians, and Peter's doing his part in Peter. And if you look at that kind of stuff, you can kind of see some bleeding over in some things and everything. It's kind of a neat little thing.
Well, yeah, and Ephesians deals with a lot about the unity between the Jewish and the Gentile church, and combining in God's purpose for the church and all those things too. So yeah, I'm tracking with you.
Yeah, so whether that's 100% right, it's just guess. My guess is just as good as yours or anybody else's. But that's the way I kind of look at it. And as far as the differences in the languages and stuff, I don't think that's the words being used or the length of the sentences and all that kind of stuff. Man, I don't put much stock into a lot of that kind of thing. I just assume that it's Paul because we're told it's Paul,
right? And
just go with it at that. But that's the kind of the things I'm thinking of when I read this. I don't know. You set out for me here something like the key themes and purposes. Ephesians more than any other book presents the purpose and plan of God for the church. You kind of addressed that briefly, but Paul writes to specific churches in specific areas for specific reasons and to address the particular problem of sinful actions that they're dealing with and such. That's back to that whole, was it a circular letter kind of a thing? I do think it's because of that emphasis of Paul's just saying, I'm at the end of my life, and this is just his attempt to like nail down the church for that church. And for those churches, and so it was meant to be kind of circulated around and everything. That's the kind of the way I get it and everything. But the purpose is to show the scope of God's eternal plan for the church and to unpack the mystery of God. Mystery of God as being the church.
The church, the presentation of the gospel, through Jesus dying on the cross and uniting Gentile and Jewish believers together, kind of like you were just talking about.
Yeah, and this is what Paul's trying to accomplish here, strengthening the church here, right? I mean, just one last get it done thing. And to show the riches of his bountiful grace and to promote unity and righteousness, living in the church, and to encourage to encourage believers to stand strong against Spiritual evil. And of course, you go back to the last chapter of Ephesians and all that, put on the armor of God stuff there. But Paul in the book of Ephesians kind of breaks it up into two sections, like most of Paul's writings. The first half is the theological stuff. That's when you're going to get theology. And then the second half is more the practical stuff. This is what I want you to do.
Which is, interestingly enough, is what a pastor should be doing too. We get the theological, and then we're supposed to get the application stuff. Yeah,
so that's what we're
following Paul is what we're doing, yeah.
But when we begin to study this, I'm sure we'll revisit all this, because you can't go through chapter 1 and not recognize that God is talking about his eternal plan. It's talking about the plan of salvation from before the world was even formed, before the world even began. This was God's purpose. This was God's plan. So he sets out the plan of salvation in that. And in chapter 2, it kind of carries on with that the new man idea, which also includes a lot of that like I would think of as sanctification, the part of the doctrine of salvation. So chapter 1, you get the doctrine of salvation. Chapter 2, you get the new man thing. And in chapter 3, the mystery of God that he talks about that was revealed to him has all to do with the church. So you have the doctrine of salvation and the new man and then the doctrine of the church. And then in chapter 4, the last half, the last 3 verses of the book of Ephesians is breaking down. That's our part. Paul starts off, this is God's part. Then it's like, this is my part. Now this is your part, kind of a thing. And I can't think of the 5 walks, but in that last half of the book of Ephesians, there's the 5 walks. I think there's actually 7, like earlier, don't walk like the others or something like that. But there's the walks that you walk in this, and he tells you how to go about your Christian walk. And so it'll be interesting when we get to that part. But that's basically the breakdown of the way the book of Ephesians is and the themes of it and things.
All right. You got any closing thoughts?
I don't know. Do you want me to throw any more rocks in there or nothing like that?
No, that's good.
Here's the thing. You can cut out everything I said if you want to.
No, it was good. All right. Well, that's your introduction for Ephesians. And like I said, next time we're going to get into it verse by verse. We're going to be looking next week at chapter 1, verses 3 through 14. And we're going to be delving into all those really theologically charged words like, predestination and election and God's choice, and what that actually means, and whether that means we're all Calvinist here, or whether it actually has nothing to do with that at all. We'll talk about that next week. You got anything?
Mm-mm.
All right. We'll see you guys next week. Have a great week. Bye.